In this interview, you'll hear from Dr. Felicia Singleton, Director of the System of Supports Department. She shares her insight into how to support grant-funded projects. Her department is currently responsible for $7 million in grant funding, which offers various services to 14 school districts.
So I just am curious to learn from you, Felicia. You've now dabbled in grants at the County Office of Ed, and I'm just curious to learn a little bit more about your experience with grants. So what has that been like for you, either here at SDCOE or in your prior work roles? What has your experience been working with grants?
So working with grants, I've been doing that for a number of years. Previously coming to San Diego County Office of Education, I was at San Diego Unified School District, and there was a portion of my counseling career that was funded by grants. I want to say it was Healthy Students, Healthy Schools, but it was, I was a middle school coordinator, so drug-free campuses, and I did a lot of work with middle schoolers around good decision-making. I taught parenting classes. So that was what it's like to work once a grant has been funded, but once I came to the county office, I got a whole other experience about the entire grant process.
And tell me a little bit more about what that grant process or that experience has been like for you at this point in your career.
Well, actually, let me back up a little. Well, I did some grant writing right before I left San Diego Unified, and the application wasn't funded. I came to the county office and originally started as a coordinator, did a lot of work around attendance and 504. And then about a year into my work at the county office, was promoted to Director of System of Supports. And I quickly found out that promotion came with, you got to find some money to fund your position. So it was overwhelming at first because writing a grant is like writing a very small, like dissertation, if you will, theory of action. You have to cite, the research. You have to come up with your proposed plan and your projects and the budget. And I had no idea. But thankfully, I got to work with you, Gabby, and I learned very quickly that writing a grant, really, you need to invest the time in being intentional about what it is that you're writing so that you can do the work after. So that was my experience, was your Director of System of Support. So the first grant I want to say it was maybe Learning Communities grant. And that was Learning Communities for Safe Schools. So working alongside you, I learned to interview our partners, right? Not just write people into the grant, but how can we make this meaningful for you? So since the time I've been at the county working with grant services, every grant that has been written has been about work that we're already doing, and then ensuring if we include partners, what support can we put in place so that they can lift the work as well.
What has been your biggest aha working with grants?
That it's more than just writing a really good narrative, really thinking hard about the proposed project, understanding the budget, understanding that when you cost out a position, you're starting at the highest pay, and that it's not free money, that there's going to be a grant report. So the biggest aha is it really makes sense for grants to connect to what you're already doing or what you're supposed to be doing so that you can make it make sense.
What has been a challenge working with grants?
Getting them off the ground. So in SDCOE, there's a pretty intensive hiring process. So that's the biggest challenge is you've written this package, you've been awarded, and the grant starts July 1 or October 1, and you may not get someone for 6 months because you have to go through this process of getting your grant award notification. And if it's a classified position, going to the Personnel Commission and getting that approved and the board approving the funds. Like there are all these steps that it's not like, here's the check, okay, go hire someone. So you may be 4 to 6 months before you can get someone hired. So that's the challenge, right? Is getting people in place and then adjusting your budget has also been a challenge because at least, especially for federal grants, they're scary, right? You have this system and you want to make sure that you're dotting I's and crossing T's. And So it's scary when you have to, contact your program officer and say, we didn't spend this money. They get it, but you want to make sure that you're not jeopardizing the whole organization. So for me, the challenge is just making sure that everyone is aware of what we're supposed to be doing and staying in alignment with what we promise, what we do.
What type of onboarding would have been helpful to you when you were first just starting with grants? What would have been the most helpful?
Fortunately, I worked with grant services, but some tips I would give folks is that timeline. So really making sure that if you're going to do this with somebody else, you assign roles, responsibilities, lines of communication. A little funny story. I remember our first grant, and I wasn't used to like checking Google Drive, and I must have been dragging my feet because you sent me a Google form on a Sunday and was like, here you are, this is your role, and this is what this is doing, this is what I'm doing. And I was like, got it. It took that one time, and I was like, understood. Like you can't sleep on a grant. Like you don't have, sometimes you have 3 weeks from the release of the RFA to submit the package. So that was very key. So get your onboarding, that is important, your onboarding process, who's involved, setting some norms, and again, roles and responsibilities. If we're going to be writing this collaboratively, check the Google Doc, every day or every other day, put notes in, let people know what you're doing so it doesn't feel like one person's carrying the load. One thing I wish I had known, I know now, you kind of just got to stop, which is really hard when you have other work to do. Everything else takes a back seat for those 3 to 4 weeks so you can get the grant written. So that's super important. And then other onboarding, the budget pieces. I'm not a budget specialist, but it's very important that you know those object codes and you know what your grant, what's allowable, so that you don't cause, again, your organization to be sanctioned and maybe loss of privileges to get more grants.
What is, you think, one of the greatest joys in having a grant funded project, or what's the greatest joy you've experienced with a grant funded project?
The greatest joy has been seeing my writing muscle strengthen, right? The first one, I was like, what am I even trying to say? I've learned that you can be really powerful in fewer words than a long verbose application, which is another challenge because you're limited to pages. So this isn't a dissertation, right? It's get it to us in this many pages or this many characters. So seeing my ability to be concise has been a joy. The sense of completion is a joy. It sounds weird, but it's super hard. But I remember the grant for school climate and being in that conference room and hovering over the submit button, that you feel a sense of accomplishment. And then by far getting that email saying, guess what? You got the money. That's a great joy. But when we write with district partners, notifying them and then watching them say, you mean I get to really hire somebody? You kept your word. That's a big deal. So there are joys along the way, but I think the big one is watching districts just be so grateful for us partnering and then seeing those services trickle down to improve the lives of students and families.
Now, your department has 2 grants. One is a state grant, one is a federal grant, both of which are multi-year grants. They each have staff that were brought on to be able to lift the work. Your role as a director, could you share a little bit about what that's like in trying to support the grant funded projects within your department? What does that look like for a director?
It looks like making sure you have really clean records, you have good communication, and that you're constantly reminding the folks that you've hired what they're there for. So it's easy to get excited about other projects or get involved in other committees. But at the end of the day, if you're funded by that grant, that's your responsibility, is to make sure that you're doing whatever we promise that we do in that grant. So it's important. And then trying to leverage, right? So if I also learn like a percentage of a person can be part grant and part department or division. So really learning how to balance that out and leverage those skills or those talents to maybe answer the deliverables of the grant, but not disrupt the whole department because they can't do anything else. So just reminding them that, if a well-written grant, if it's written well, it'll have those embedded connections.
What would you say to someone that is in a similar situation as you, where they've had some grants, maybe here or there sprinkled throughout their K-12 experience, and they're now joining the County Office of Education in a department that has several grants or is a department that constantly looks at grants? What are some tidbits or a grant pro tip that you would have for somebody that would be stepping into a similar role?
Again, look for grants that have a natural connection to what you do. Be very clear with personnel that you hire that's connected to the grant, that it's our hope that we can get more grants or these positions can become embedded in the general fund. But the last thing you want to do is have someone come on board with false hope that they're just there, right? So be very transparent and then do what you can to sustain the work. So how can you capture data and share with your direct supervisor or assistant superintendent or the board, right, on the difference that this work has made so that there's value in it and maybe it can be absorbed in the general fund. So not just coming in to do the work and saying, okay, that's it, but really trying to make an imprint and an impact, again, in the lives of children and families so that the work is valued enough that it's seen as a position that we need at SDCOE.
Is there anything else you'd like our listeners or our viewers to consider when they are implementing their grants or just getting started? Any advice that you'd have for them?
The grant officers that I've worked with at the state and the federal are very supportive, and they want you to win, right? They want you to succeed. So always, and when in doubt, ask a question. Don't just spend money, and you don't want to get into a situation where you're audited or you're trying to prove what you did. So work with your team, work with grant services, and make sure you're in communication with your program officer. Sketch out a calendar ahead of time. It's super important that you know when your reports are due so that you can plan accordingly. And do what stay committed to what you say you're going to do. And then just because a grant comes up and someone encourages you to write for it, if it's not useful for you, don't write for it. I mean, if I could just be myself, all money ain't good money. And when you get that grant money, you're accountable for it. And if you feel like it's too much or it's too daunting to the work that you were hired to do, let it pass. Let it pass and just trust that when the opportunity comes and it's right, it'll present itself for you.
Thank you, Dr. Singleton.